Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with the South secedes, talking about the secession of the southern states, and kind of some of the background of that and what that led to and things like that. But we're now on to the day of the Confederacy. This will be a little longer, so hope you'll stick with me for this one. During the first half of the Confederacy held the advantage, especially in the East. Robert E. Lee, the son of Light Horse Harry Lee of the Revolution, was a Virginian who did not want secession, but thought his primary allegiance was due to his state. He was possibly the ablest general and certainly the most attractive figure among the military leaders on either side. It is typical that the North selected a civilian, uh, Lincoln, as its most idolized figure. The South selected Lee, a military hero. The chief battle of 1861 was at Bull Run, called by the South Manassas, between the two capitals, Washington and Richmond. It was a Confederate victory, but not a decisive one. Stonewall Jackson, Lee's ablest general, here gained his nickname by the consistency of his troops, but the Confederates were unable to push on to Washington. General George McClellan, called to military leadership, was just a man to reorganize the defeated Union Army. He was an excellent drill master and too cautious to expose untried troops to battle, but time revealed two defects. He was overcautious, always imagining the foe to be stronger than his own forces, and insubordinate in his attitude toward his civilian superiors. Once he was too busy to see Lincoln, and the President patient said, "I will hold McClellan's horse if he will bring us victory." McClellan had a plan. He wanted to take advantage of the naval superiority of the Union to transport troops to the peninsula in eastern Virginia and to advance towards Richmond. But Confederate strategy forced the withdrawal of Union troops to defend Washington, and Richmond was not captured. Lincoln experimented with other generals, Ambrose Burnside, Pope, and Joseph Hooker. They were less cautious than McClellan and equally successful. Finally, he had to recall McClellan to command. Unlike Davis, Lincoln lacked military training and experience, but whatever his errors in conducting the war, he kept steadily in mind the restoration of the whole Union. And nothing irked him more than generals who were content to limit their vision to the north and say, "We have repelled the enemy from our soil." A new era in naval warfare arrived with the fight between two ironclad ships, the Confederate uh, Merrimac and the Union Monitor. The South won its greatest victory and suffered its greatest loss at Chancellorsville. A victory by Jackson, but one which cost him his life. When he first heard that when Lee, never mind, my bad. When he first heard that Jackson had lost an arm, Lee said in his gracious way, "You have lost your left arm. Am I right?" This proved to be true. Jackson was perhaps as great a tactician as Lee, although he could never have managed public relations with the temperamental Davis half as well. Diplomatic difficulties were added to Lincoln's trouble. An American naval officer seized two Confederate agents, Mason and Slidell. Slidell? Weird name. Never seen that one before. From the British. The British demanded their surrender, and Lincoln wisely acquiesced, saying, "One war at a time." Later, there was a controversy over the building of Confederate rams in British shipyards. There was much sympathy with the Confederates in conservative British circles, and a general conviction that the South would win. Napoleon III, the French emperor, cared nothing for the merits of the war, but he was busy with military plans in Mexico, which a divided United States could not prevent. So that's about the end of the talking, but just gonna make sure that they don't have anything else to say. There's a lot of pictures we're gonna get into, don't worry. Nope, okay. So they were somewhat correct in what they have stated here. Things like Lee being the best general, it depends. Lee is definitely a very good general, but honestly, the best would have been Ulysses Grant. Grant, while he did have faults, of course, one thing Grant had over a lot of these guys is that he knew just how to use his troops to the most advantage. So, a lot of the other generals, like McClellan and things like that, McClellan especially, they always had this view that they were weaker than the enemy. But one thing that they kind of never thought about, but Grant would, is Grant had many more troops than the South. Let's say a battle happened and they lost 10 men, and the Confederates lost 5. Well, for the Confederacy, that 5 is of a much higher value than the 10. Now, obviously, losing 10 men is still not great, and 5, of course, but if you're looking at it from the numbers of who would win, if you can lose 10 and not really matter, but if you lose 5 and that really matters, that really comes into it. And one thing that Grant kind of gets nicknamed is a butcher because of all the things that he did, but he's really not. Grant is a very smart man that later historical revisionism, let's say, has painted him very poorly and painted Lee as much greater. Lee is very good, but um, Lee sometimes, not sometimes actually, Lee a lot of times would play a little too traditional with tactics. And yeah, he was very good in executing those. He's probably the best of those traditional tactics, but sometimes he would have trouble uh, working on his feet, let's say. But now let's get into the picture. At the top here is General Robert E. Lee. The Army of the Confederate States of America, yeah, of the Army of the Confederate States of America. Lee was a brilliant tactician and strategist, but he never evolved an overall concept of Southern strategy, partly because the South organized itself into discrete and often non-cooperating military districts. Later in life, Lee came to symbolize the reconciliation of North and South. Yeah, that's the other thing. Lee, he didn't dislike the Union. He just thought his loyalties lied with his state. So he was not opposed to rejoining the Union, um, if that was the decision of the state, kind of thing. And Lee, I've said it in a previous video, but Lee is more or less American royalty. His wife is a descendant of the family of George Washington. Now, it's not George Washington's child, because Washington didn't have any children, but it's his adopted child. So it is still very important. Lee's house is not Lincoln's, is Washington's old house, um, and he could see the Capitol from his house. So he's a very important individual, and so if they can use him later, it definitely would have. But um, let's see at the bottom here, crew members cooking on the deck of the Monitor in the James River on the 9th of July, 1862. The Monitor, an ironclad, um, had engaged the Merrimac, a Confederate ironclad steam frigate, on the 8th of March, 1862, at Hampton Roads, just off the coast from Norfolk, geez almighty, Virginia. Slip of the tongue, you could say. Although outgunned 10 to 2, the Monitor held its own in the duel. Neither ship was able to do serious damage to the other, but the Merrimac withdrew, never again to figure in the war. The engagement did mark a turning point in naval history, since it proved that old-fashioned wooden ships were obsolete. The North later built more ironclads, but the South could not produce another Merrimac. Yeah, this is the age of ironclads. Not an age that really lasts very long, but it shows the future of naval warfare. You know, you have the big metal ships of today, and it really starts with kind of the ironclads. Now, you could say maybe it started somewhat with Korea. Korea had these turtle ships, which it did have iron plates on top of them and things like that. But this is a fully metal ship, a little different than that. That's a wooden ship with iron on it, kind of thing. This is a fully iron ship. These ironclads, they're quite effective. Uh, they just kind of get obsolete because of how fast naval technology really moves. And so, very interesting ships, very interesting design, very interesting function. They work pretty well. Um, yeah, really shows old-fashioned naval warfare is not so much the norm anymore. And below is Alan Pinkerton smoking a pipe. So right here maybe? Seems really the only pipe smoker. The chief of General George B. McClellan's intelligence service, with his men near Cumberland County, Virginia, in 1862. Yeah, intelligence kind of gets forgotten about in a lot of warfare, especially back a certain way. But intelligence is very important. You need men scouting, spies. Those are very obviously useful for combat information. But clearly not good enough because McClellan always assumes his enemy is way more powerful than he is. And so many a blunder comes from McClellan's own fears. And then here's this overleaf here. I'll have to read that. I'll read it and then I'll show you. So the overleaf is one of the major battles of the Peninsular Campaign, the Battle of Williamsburg. It cost the Union forces over 2,000 casualties. Yeah, one of those battles is not necessarily talked about as much, the Battle of Williamsburg, but 2,000 casualties, that's a big deal. That means 2,000 dead and wounded, of course. Um, so, yeah, but you can see, I'm glad they, okay, well, it's kind of showing there. Hopefully YouTube doesn't flag it, because it's history. Sorry, guys, I know you don't like it, but it is. But yeah, you can see Stars and Stripes versus the, not the Stars and Bars, actually, but most people would call it that. But yeah, you can see. And one thing here, I wonder, it looks like a black man. There were black troops on the Union side. Um, very hard fighting individuals. Awful, awful stories if they get captured, though. Very, very sad. They would be treated, obviously, I'm sure you can probably imagine, very harshly. And there was a decree that the South would make that any Union leader, any white man leading a troop of black troops, would be executed, and so would all the troops. That gets overturned because the Union also decries something else, and so kind of they don't do that, but it almost came to it. At the left here is Union artillery taking up position in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Yeah, always got to get your artillery in the right space. Blue Ridge Mountains, decent place for them, right? And below, this is quite the big picture here. The Confederate Army was well positioned in the town and on the heights above Fredericksburg before the Union forces were deployed. From this impregnable position, Lee beat off the rash frontal attack that General Ambrose Burnside launched on the 13th of December, 1862. Now, Burnside he does lose this battle, and it's pretty bad. Fredericksburg being, if I remember correctly, the largest battle in the entire war, largest amount of troops on both sides. Um, it's a very, very bloody battle. Uh, but Burnside, even though this is technically his blunder, it's not fully his fault. Now, he should have maybe um, canceled the attack or something like that. That's what he should have done, of course. So that is his fault. But um, Burnside, at all turns, is getting screwed over by the quartermaster and a lot of his other generals. A lot of them did not think he should have been in charge. And so he gets a lot of pushback against them, and they will sabotage him at many points. And this is one of them. Burnside orders these pontoon bridges to cross the river to get into Fredericksburg way, way earlier. And in turn they get delayed, they get delayed, they get delayed until finally they show up. But then by then it's too late. If they had been there when uh, Burnside wanted them, this battle may have gone differently, and it probably would have for sure. But that doesn't happen, and instead it's a Union defeat, and it's just awful because you got these guys that are fighting tooth and nail against Burnside when Burnside knew he shouldn't have been in charge, but he was trying his best realistically, and some of his defeats were not really his fault at the end of the day. It says the opposite below, but this is not the opposite below. This is up top. But whatever. It's a company of Union soldiers photographed during the Sharpsburg campaign. Sharpsburg campaign, um, very interesting campaign. You can see these Union troops, and remember, this 1860s. There is photography. It's interesting seeing some of these photos because these are really old photos. These are what, over 150 or so years now. So long, long time ago. Actually, but what, it'd be about 160 years, almost exactly. Not quite, but close enough. Okay, well, I'll try to read this overleaf and show it while I'm reading it. It's the resistance of the Confederate Army outside Chattanooga refuted the rumor that they were in retreat. General Braxton Bragg had retreated into the city, and when Union General William S. Rosecrans and his troops advanced on Chattanooga and took the city on the 9th of September 1863, they found that Bragg had entrenched his men in the mountain outside the town. Rosecrans advanced and was badly beaten at Chickamauga, my bad, uh, on the 19th to the 20th of September, and was replaced by General George H. Thomas. Yeah, Rosecrans makes this attack. Once again, another Union general that just makes these attacks and they just horribly fail. He should not have attacked this position. Why he attacked this position? Hubris, probably. And the Civil War, the American Civil War here, really shows a lot of the trench warfare. Trench warfare has been something that has been around for thousands and thousands of years at this point. However, modern trench warfare, like what we would think of in World War One or even like stuff that happens now, a lot of that kind of gets a start in the American Civil War a little earlier. Napoleonic, actually, you could say some, but you can see a lot of the tactics that get learned for the First World War kind of get learned here, and so you have a lot of these guys that'll get entrenched, and it's impossible to remove them almost. Like, the military technology of the time, you've got Gatling guns and things like that, and it's like, man, you really can see the modern World War One entrenchment. Yeah, look at these photos, real interesting. But with that, that is going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways I can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I just appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.